Hi, everybody. So this is the recap of last week. So the reason why I'm doing these videos that recap the previous week is I don't want to spoon feed you the ideas about what you're reading the week that you're doing the reading. So I didn't want to tell you too much about, for example, The Dream of the Brood last week, because I want you to come to your own thoughts on what you think the reading is about before you hear what I have to say. And basically, I want you to be able to basically reach your own conclusions and then look at the conclusions of people on the discussion board before I say something about the readings themselves. So that's the purpose of these recap videos. Also, this gives me an opportunity to maybe say something, where there was trouble in the previous week that needs to be rectified, something like that. So last week you read Caedmon's Hymn, you read 2 elegies from the Exeter book, and you read Dream of the Brood. So those were the readings, and those are what you did the discussion forum about. So real quickly, I'm just going to click on the discussion forum. So you had essentially 3 sources of readings, so that worked out nicely just to have 3 people be discussion starters for last week. Some weeks it might vary depending on the number of readings we have. Like when we get into things like sonnets, for example, where you might be assigned a handful of sonnets because they're not very long. I might have one person do sonnets 1, 3, and 5, and another person do sonnets 2, 4, and 6, because maybe there's some connection between the sonnets, or it's a way to break it up. So it'll vary from week to week. And because there's no set number of individuals, or there's no, it's different people every week doing the discussion starters, I have to input the grades manually for the discussion forum. So what that means is, I realize that my Moodle looks a little different than yours, but when you go to the grades, what will happen is I'll have to manually put in a column, one for the person or the people who did the discussion starter, and one for everybody else. Because if you started the discussion, you get a few more points just for being the one to kick off the discussion. And if I tried to stick you all in the same column with some of you being eligible for more points than others, what basically happens is the people who didn't start discussion get penalized. So I have to create 2 separate columns. So once I've done that, when you go to your grades and you look at that, you'll see that there might be a column where you don't have a score at all. It won't be a 0. It'll just be a dash like it is now here. And that's because you weren't a discussion starter that week. And then the reading response will be 1 column for everybody. So you can see that there's already a column for that. Okay, so so this is last week. You can see that I added a bunch of things for you to listen to, and then at the bottom is the link for the discussion forum and the link for the reading response. Since we do discussion forums and reading responses every week, I'm going to try to keep these at the bottom so that you know that things that you need to do or turn in are at the bottom. Okay, so let's take a look at week 3. So for this week, you're going to be reading Beowulf and also the Canterbury Tales. I only picked one story out of the Canterbury Tales because it's really long. But I wanted you to read the prologue because if you don't read the prologue, you don't understand basically what's happening. In a sense, the people in the Canterbury Tales are all doing sort of like a mission trip. And so they're all taking this trip together. And to keep themselves busy, they tell each other tales along the way, in order to pass the time. So the only one I've given you is The Wife of Bath. So please read the prologue just for the background, but The Wife of Bath is the actual tale. And then we don't have history this week, so I don't have a history video for you. So it'll just be this recap video. And then, like last week, you've got a discussion forum, and you'll have a weekly reading response. And just to look ahead, next week, you will have a recap like I'm doing now, but you'll also have a history video, and I forgot to put that in there as well. So next week, I'll be covering the Renaissance and early 17th century. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about your readings from week 2. And by the way, everybody did a really good job on the discussion. I was so happy. Your discussion responses were great. So I was really glad to see that you all were, participating in a conversation, and that really made me happy. So the more you get involved and the more comments you respond to, the better. And I really like seeing you guys bounce ideas off of each other. Okay, so let's take a look at what you did last week. So the first poem was Caedmon's Hymn, which was recorded by Bede, and he's sometimes called Saint Bede or the Venerable Bede. Essentially, he was a religious figure who wrote down this hymn because Caedmon was illiterate and unable to do so. So I've put actually the whole poem up here because it's so short. Now, if you look around in other books or online, you'll find versions of this hymn that vary, and that's basically due to translation because the original was in Old English, and then Bede recorded it in Latin, and then it was translated into modern English. So sometimes the wording is different, and the overall gist is the same, but the precise wording is usually different from translation to translation. Okay, so the hymn goes, "Now we must ought to praise heaven kingdom's guardian, the maker's might and his mind's thoughts, the work of the glory Father, as he of each of wonders, eternal Lord, established a beginning. He first shaped for men's sons heaven as a roof, the holy creator, then middle earth, mankind's guardian, eternal Lord, afterwards prepared the earth for men, the Lord Almighty." Essentially, we're seeing part of Genesis being retold here. The thrust of the hymn is that we must praise God, the creator, because he shaped for man heaven as the roof and earth as what is underneath the roof for mankind. So it's essentially a hymn to praise God for the heavens and the earth. The reason why this is this hymn is so interesting, other than its content, is because, according to Bede, Quedemont used words that were too advanced given his illiteracy. So Bede felt that this particular hymn had a divine origin. So that has sort of stuck with the hymn as giving it some kind of a religious importance. Also, too, this is one of the few pieces we have, I believe it's 8th century. So it's one of the few pieces we have that goes so far back, partly due to age, but also partly due to Henry VIII destroying a bunch of monasteries. We lost a lot of really old literature when those monasteries were destroyed, because monasteries served that function of, keeping writings and books and, documents, because for hundreds and hundreds of years, learned people were generally monks or priests or so on. So this particular hymn is one of the few things that we have that is that old. So as far as religious content, there really is nothing new being added here. It's just a hymn to praise God for the heavens and the earth. So that in itself isn't unusual. But the fact that Bede felt it had divine inspiration makes it unusual. And its age also makes it unusual. Okay. I gave you two pieces from the Exeter book Elegies. One is The Wanderer, and the other was The Wife's Lament. So I took a few pieces from The Wanderer, just because I felt that they really captured this particular piece. And even though only The Wife's Lament is named a lament, essentially both are a lament, although the topics are different. So the Wanderer is quoted for a large part of this piece. And at one point he says, and this is on page 41 if you want to look, he says, "The weary mind cannot withstand word." And the word means fate, but mostly it means bad things that happen. So it means fate, but not, maybe good fate. It means a negative fate. So he says, "The weary mind cannot withstand word. The troubled heart can offer no help." So the wanderer is lost and aching in both mind and heart. And he goes on to explain that just as I have had to take my own heart, often wretched, cut off from my homeland and far from dear kinsmen. So the reason why his mind and heart ache is because he is no longer in his homeland and he is no longer near the people that he loves. And he continues, "How cruel a companion is sorrow." So he's been wandering after having been in war by himself, and he is in pain because he's alone. And the people who he is telling his tale to feel that he is wise, but that the only way that he will recover from the pain that he feels is if he receives consolation from God. So telling his tale, meeting other people, traveling around is never going to heal the pain that he feels. The only way that he can be healed is through divine consolation. Part of the reason why this relates to the lives of the people in this time period is that if you remember the history lecture, a lot of these English sort of small tribal groups were relocated, or they relocated themselves, when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes all came in and moved into England. So there were lots of battles, these groups clashed with each other, and people were split apart from those they knew, and they were split apart from the places they lived in most of their lives. So English tribes that maybe lived in the eastern part of England found themselves going completely west into Wales in order to escape the invaders. So in a sense, he was cut off from his homeland through these battles that he went through. So there's a lot of reflection in the medieval period about not just religious topics. I mean, we do see these all throughout this week's reading, but also the connections that people have with kinsmen, or, you know, the people that they lived near or were family with or were friends with. And so a lot of times we're seeing this, instead of trying to establish new bonds with new groups of people, we see people turning to God for comfort. Okay. The second one is the wife's lament. This is not a lament being told to somebody. The wife is essentially the writer of the lament. And she begins by saying, "I suffer the torment of my exile." So here we have another situation where somebody has been cut off from the friends and family and kinsmen that they knew. However, the reasoning is very different. She says, "My lord," her husband, "commanded me to live here. I had few loved ones or loyal friends in this country, which causes me grief. Then I found my most fitting man was unfortunate, filled with grief, concealing his mind, plotting murder with a smiling face. So often we swore that only death could ever divide us, nothing else. All that is changed now. It is now as it had never been, our friendship. Far and near, I must endure the hatred of my dearest one." So initially, her husband leaves and she is sent elsewhere where she is not from, which was painful for her to lose both her husband and her friends and family. But then she finds that her husband has changed. And although the book notes that some of this is hard to translate, my interpretation of this was she discovered that when her husband left, he became a different person, and he sort of became a bad person who faked being a good one. That's a sort of layman's way of putting it. He's plotting murder with a smiling face. So he has negative intentions, but he uses guile to hide it. And the man that she knew, she thought they would never truly be separated except by death. But instead, how he has changed has divided them, and they are no longer friends. And in fact, she must endure what he has become. At the end of the lament is another place where they say, it's difficult to translate, but she says, may the young man always be sad-minded, with hard heart thoughts, yet let him have a smiling face along with his heartache, a crowd of constant sorrows. Let to himself all his worldly joys belong. Let him be outlawed in a far distant land, so that my friend sits under stone cliffs, chilled by storms, weary-minded, surrounded by water in a sad, dreary hall. My beloved will suffer the cares of a sorrowful mind. He will remember too often a happier home. Woe to the one who must wait with longing for a loved one. So, although the translation apparently is difficult, I personally interpreted this to mean, I wish to curse my Lord, my husband, with the pain that I feel. I want him to be sad. I want his heart to hurt, even though he still smiles. I want him to only have worldly joy, which implies I don't want him to have divine joy. I don't want him to have love, either from another person or from God. Let him be outlawed in a distant land. So let him be exiled like I am. I wish him to sit under stone cliffs, chilled by storms, weary-minded, surrounded by water in a sad, dreary hall. So just let him be physically miserable. My beloved will suffer the cares of a sorrowful mind. So he will be sad and remember the happiness he used to have. Woe to the one who must wait with longing for a loved one. So woe to him who will wait for me, but I will never come. So I hope this recap of the laments in the Exeter book helps explain them a little better. Okay, the last one was The Dream of the Rood, and The Dream of the Rood uses what we call a framing device. So the narrator of The Dream of the Rood is telling us of a dream that he had. So this story is of the dream is surrounded by him telling us that this is a dream he had, and ending with his prayer. So The Dream of the Rood essentially is the story of the crucifixion, but it's unusual because it is told from the position of the cross, or which also is the rood, or he sometimes refers to it as the Savior's tree. So I beheld in sorrow the Savior's tree, until I heard it utter a sound. That best of woods began to speak words. So it is a very unusual retelling of the crucifixion, in that it comes from the position of the cross, and the cross itself is given the ability to recount the tale, whereas in general, most people don't even consider the cross as an entity that could tell a tale. So it's never given any kind of personification. So on page 50, the cross begins to tell its tale. It was so long ago, I remember it still, that I was felled from the forest edge, ripped up from my roots. Strong enemies seized me there, made me their spectacle, made me bear their criminals. They bore me on their shoulders and set me on a hill. Enemies enough fixed me fast. Then I saw the Lord of mankind hasten eagerly when he wanted to ascend upon me. I did not dare to break or bow down against the Lord's word when I saw the ends of the earth tremble. So this is very unusual. Here we have a cross that remembers being a tree, remembers being cut down by the Romans, and erected on a hill, apparently suffering other crucifixions until Jesus's crucifixion. Let's see. And the Rood remembers the crucifixion as something that Jesus embraced. He said he wanted to ascend upon me. The young hero was made ready. He ascended on the high gallows. So the Rood has no memory of Jesus being forced into being on the cross. I raised up the mighty King, the Lord of heaven. I dared not lie down. They drove dark nails through me. The scars are still visible, open wounds of hate. I dared not harm any of them. They mocked us both together. I was all drenched in blood flowing from that man's side after he had sent forth his spirit. And it continues on after Jesus had died to where the cross is lowered. And essentially the Rood is still viewing the situation as I was humbled. This was amazing. They took God, they took him from his torment. He was weary from a mighty battle. So it's a very interesting perspective upon the death of Jesus. And let's see. At the very end, when the dream is over, the narrator said, I prayed to the tree with a happy heart, eagerly, there where I was alone with little company. My spirit longed to start on the journey forth. It felt so much of longing. It is now my life's hope that I may seek the tree of victory alone, more often than all men, and honor it well. I wish for that with all my heart, and my hope of protection is fixed on the cross. So the narrator wishes to find the original cross and pay homage to it, to give it the honor that it deserves. He does address Jesus at the end, saying, may the Lord be my friend. He who here on earth once suffered on the hanging tree for human sin, he ransomed us and gave us life, a heavenly home. So although he does praise Jesus, he takes the unusual twist to praise the cross. Okay, so for next time, you have Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales to read. So Beowulf is an epic, although not nearly as long as the traditional epics we would think of, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then I already explained the Canterbury Tales. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck. And thanks so much for the great discussion. Keep it up.